I'm very excited to welcome this next panel. As with any industry, digital assets and blockchain industry is not immune from bad actors. And we here at the Digital Chamber believe it's critical that we get industry and government in the room, not only to discuss those issues, but also discuss solutions. And that's what this next panel is going to do. I'm very excited to introduce our moderator, Jamal El-Hindi, Counsel at Clifford, who will introduce the panelists. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Cody, for that introduction. And I've been looking forward to this panel all week, in part because I get to talk to a group of folks, many of whom I've known for several years. And I think what we're going to try to do here is to have a conversation as much as anything else in front of you and capture, actually, some of the rapport and some of the ideas that we had in some of our prep sessions as well. The topic is pretty heady, the truth of cryptocurrency, illicit finance, and sanctions. I'll set the stage for that, but first let me introduce my co-panelist. Down at the end is Carole House, Director for Cryptocurrency and Secure Digital Innovation at the National Security Council, the White House. Choi, National Crypto Enforcement Team, also known as NCET at the Department of Justice, where she is the director. We've got Redbord, Head of Legal and Government Affairs at TRM Labs, and Todd Conklin, Counselor to the Deputy Secretary at Treasury for Cyber. And I'm Jamal El-Hindi from Clifford Chance. Let me just set the stage in terms of the topic. We've had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And immediately, everyone thought, well, how is cryptocurrency, how are digital assets going to play into this? How is money going to be moved around? How are sanctions going to be evaded? There's a lot of concern. There's a lot of immediate concern in Congress in terms of focusing on legislation to toughen sanctions, particularly with respect to cryptocurrency, digital assets, and Russia. Then there was pushback from industry, essentially feeling like they may have been targeted as part of those legislative efforts, and actually raising the point, well, to the extent that the whole industry is based on blockchain and distributed ledger technologies where information is actually fairly open, were some of these efforts misplaced? The truth is somewhere in the middle in terms of where there needs to be focus and where there doesn't need to be focus. And as a group, we're going to cover a few topics. Acknowledging that there are risks in the crypto sphere for illicit finance and sanctions evasion, but also noting that there's opportunity in terms of the analytic tools out there to thwart that. While on the one hand, there might not need to be a need for panic, nobody should be sticking their heads in the sand at this point. And I led it off with a discussion of the Russian invasion, but let's face it, this is not all about Russian oligarchs. And there's some concern as to whether or not we're seeing a bifurcation within the industry in terms of actors who are really trying to get on the right side of things and some that might be turning their heads the other way. And finally, it's not just a crypto issue in and of itself, but a broader cybersecurity issue as well. So with that, I'm going to throw out some questions. I've told the panelists to ask questions to each other as well. And again, try to have some of that conversation that we had earlier. But I'm going to start with Carole. Carole, help us set the stage in terms of, given everything that you've done, and you are an advocate for truth. You're an advocate for understanding within industry of what it's actually capable of and what some of the risks are. But within that context, spell out some of the risks that you're seeing in your space and how some of these risks are different from what you've seen with respect to other parts of the financial sector.
I really appreciate that question. So first, to have a really fulsome discussion about risk, you really have to examine the different parts of the risk equation, which means understanding the threats, the vulnerabilities that are being exploited, and the mitigations that are present. So when looking at cryptocurrencies, I mean, you have these assets and technologies that inherently are not evil or good. Just like any financial system or technology, they can be exploited based on their characteristics. And then, like I mentioned, the risk features that exist surrounding that technology. So with cryptocurrency, they have such great potential for efficient payments, cross-border reach, immediate settlement. But all those features that make them very attractive for licit users also make them very attractive potentially for illicit users. So this potential to send a wire transfer from my pocket to yours anywhere in the world without an intermediary, and there's nothing that prevents me from being in North Korea or you from being in Iran. The absence of those mitigations being built in really speak to the foundation for why there are such risks in this space at times, but also why there's potential for mitigating them because cash and SWIFT don't publish on a public ledger the way that many of these systems do as well. So ultimately, I'll say that you see on the threat landscape that cybercriminals favor the use of cryptocurrency for laundering, whether it's purchasing their exploit kits up front or laundering the proceeds on the back end. It is a favorite tool, and for a lot of reasons based on those features that make them very attractive to illicit users. We've also seen it used in a variety of types of activities, just like we see dollars used in a variety of illicit activities, whether it's narcotics trafficking, proliferation financing, human trafficking, child sexual exploitation, you name it. So that's the threat landscape. The vulnerabilities that are being exploited really point to the absence of building in some basic fundamental features that you want in a financial system, like identity, like sanction screening, poor cybersecurity measures, potentially enabling illicit actors like rogue states to steal significant amounts of funds to support their proliferation activities. Then on the mitigation side, there's great potential for these technologies. We talked about the potential for any of the public unobscured ledgers out there to be used, but there's also other measures like regulatory obligations that are really key mitigating factors that exist in the space. Of course, going back to vulnerabilities, the complete insufficiency of sufficient international regulation on the anti-money laundering front is the greatest vulnerability that the White House has seen that is currently being exploited in the conduct of illicit finance involving cryptocurrency. So hopefully that does a good job at outlining some of the core features of crypto, the threat landscape, the vulnerabilities that are being exploited, and some of the mitigations that could be in place, some of them that are not, some of them that are growing, like under the Financial Action Task Force work. But I think all of that really points to why there's such significant risk that the US government sees.
Right, I'm going to pull on that thread just a little bit more before we go on to some things that the government's doing to address the risk. But when we get to this basic notion, I think you touched on it, but just a little bit more on the fact that, again, the basic premise to the layperson is, well, wait a second. If all of this information is actually on some kind of public ledger as opposed to behind a bank wall or something like that, why isn't that actually safer? And I think that, you've said in some ways it is, but in some ways it isn't.
Yeah, it's really just the absence of that core identity. If you don't have sufficient international regulation to ensure that there's identity somewhere on the other side of these transfers through KYC obligations at the exchanges, you also have these systems that were built not building in features like digital identity. So I think even if there's tons of information available to see, the public address and public key associated with that activity, that combined with the fact that there's nothing that makes it inevitable that these systems remain public and unobscured. So we see layer 2 solutions, we see the future of privacy-preserving technologies that are being built. I think there has to be deliberate foresight and thought put into how you make sure that there is that lawful discoverability built into these systems. So that's certainly a concern that I see.
Jamal, can jump in on that.
Yeah.
You alluded to the bifurcation in the industry in your opening remarks, and I just want to dovetail with Carole's points. That's what we've observed too in the sanctions designation space and post designation, and take any of the sanctioned entities recently in the last 6 months from Suex to Garantex to the Hydra market. You've seen an initial significant reduction in counterparty activity, either for transactions going in or out of, for example, Hydra market, but there still is transactions flowing through the Hydra market to the broader ecosystem today, right? And then even though the counterparties have shrunk significantly, which is great, a great sign that sanctions do work and can be impactful in this space, they've shrunk to a different part of the crypto ecosystem where we have less visibility. And so now the question is, what side is your firm going to be in that space? Are you going to be on the side of regulation in the U.S. government and supporting sanctions regime for something as significant and impactful as the current Russia sanctions effort, or are you going to go to the other end and move to the other part of the ecosystem? And I really think it's a decision that the industry has to make, and it has to police itself at some point, right? Because then the question becomes, how many hops become acceptable for your organization from that sanctioned entity or from that exchange that is accepting sanctioned transactions? And I think that's the open question, and that's what we have to get to.
Yeah, and just to sort of piggyback on that, I mean, Todd got into sanctions a little bit, and I think what's so interesting is that, Carole eloquently talked about sort of the open ledger and this ability to, trace and track transactions in real time in ways that were impossible, in fiat currency. I was a prosecutor for about 11 years at the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., and we investigated bulk cash smuggling and networks of hawalas and shell companies and high-value art and real estate. And there's no TRM labs to trace and track those transactions, right? And what crypto allows for is us to potentially regulate and enforce in new and different ways. And I mean, what Todd and Treasury and OFAC are doing today is really extraordinary, and I think shows the power of the ability to regulate sort of in the crypto space. You had the Ronin blockchain hack, a month or so ago, and really since that time, what we've seen is, Treasury used blockchain analytics tools in real time to bring sanctions actions, right? We saw the funds move to an address that was ultimately sanctioned. We then saw the funds move again to 3 additional addresses, which in real time essentially were tracked and then sanctioned by OFAC. We saw them go through a Blender IO, through a mixing service that was ultimately sanctioned. This is unprecedented for my experience, certainly at Treasury, where it could take weeks, months, years to sanction behavior. Here we're seeing it almost in real time, and that's an only in crypto kind of story, right? That doesn't happen in any other sort of financial system.
So that you're raising good points in terms of how we are in an environment where there is this opportunity, but everybody has to take advantage of that opportunity as well. And do you think that the industry is appropriately focused on some of the things that it can do? I mean, Ari is talking about some of the tools that are essentially out there. From your space, are you seeing examples where they're not appropriately focused?
Without getting into specifics, I would like to say generally, I think that everyone within industry is, I think we're all properly incentivized in the right direction, and that in order to everyone's mutual benefit, industry's benefit, the work that we do in government to keep the American public safe from risks generally, criminal activity generally, for there to be robust anti-money laundering, know your customer protocols, procedures, and the like, as is sort of set forth in FATF recommendations, among other things. And given that situation, I think there are industry players who are being responsible in the area and understanding as part of the growth. Given that the industry has grown and evolved quite quickly in a very short period of time, that investments need to be made into compliance programs to make sure that they're doing their part to monitor for illicit activity and risks that exist on their platforms. I think our concern is, again, we would like to see situations in which private actors, firms in the industry can be a little more proactive in certain circumstances, the ones that Todd and Ari illustrated, for instance. We are seeing, even as we sanction even as OFAC sanctions particular addresses, 1 or 2 hops from large actors who are still engaging in transactions with wallets and addresses that can clearly be linked to bad activity. And I think that no one wants ransomware to be a problem. No one wants sanctions evasion to exist to help. They're important in order to ensure national security interests of the American public. And so we would like to be in a position where when private firms see bad actions on their platforms, they feel comfortable coming to law enforcement saying, hey, we're seeing this, proactively shutting things down and being a little forward-leaning in their compliance posture. Because if for no other reason, even if you don't believe that it's for the mutual benefit of the industry, it does pose a business risk and a compliance risk and enforcement risk to the business itself if they continue to operate in an irresponsible manner when they see that type of activity.
And I mean, just take Hydra Market, for example. Is there anyone in this room who didn't know that Hydra Market was one of the largest criminal darknet markets in the world prior to OFAC sanctioning them and law enforcement taking significant action? I think everyone in the world who's in this business understood that, right? So why did major international exchanges still serve as counterparties for one-hop transactions directly in and out of Hydra Market prior to the designation? So why wait for the U.S. government to take an action, and make it illegal for you to transact before you de-risk, right? Same could be said for SUEX. Why allow a SUEX to operate on your platform and leverage your platform for their technical survival when you're well aware that the predominant business going through SUEX is criminal activity, right? Why wait for the U.S. government to act first? I mean, to be responsible players, you have to be more proactive than that. You have to de-risk before the U.S. government takes action and not wait for the U.S. government to act.
Ari, is it from the industry perspective, and just for full disclosure, Carole, Ari, Todd, and I were all at the Treasury Department at the same time, and so we've probably had some of these discussions back when we were in government together. Young is the odd person out from the Department of Justice, but Ari, do you feel that there are some out there in industry that are essentially waiting for the other shoe to drop, and as opposed to trying to, Young asked for people to be more proactive. What do you see?
Yeah, I think that less and less is the answer to that, certainly. I think, we work with the largest crypto businesses and financial institutions, and I can tell you, I mean, they are building out truly robust compliance controls, right? They're hiring sort of the right people, they're using the right tools. Just as an example, and this is a little outside of the national security space, but more in sort of the hacks and the frauds and the scams and other sort of trust issues in the crypto space, TRM and Binance US and Circle and Hedera and others, we put out something called Chain Abuse last week, where it's literally a crowdsourcing, a Waze for crypto scams and hacks. But to me, it answers your question directly, and that is like, this is the crypto industry coming together and saying, something, the nature of crypto, right, the open ledger and open blockchains actually allow us to sort of monitor ourselves, have some self-policing going on. And I think we've seen a lot more of that in the space than we've seen sort of folks sort of going the other direction, right? I think that the amazing work I think that Treasury, and DOJ has done in particular is continue to go after what I love that Todd calls the illicit underbelly of the sort of overall growing crypto economy. You see darknet mixing services, that DOJ has gone after, or darknet markets, non-compliant exchanges, because it feels to me like there's an understanding that the overall crypto economy is growing illicit. And we all, I think, want to do away with this illicit underbelly in order to sort of see that new financial system grow.
Okay. So, Young, without getting into specific investigations, this whole notion of bifurcation going on in industry, and Ari talking about, the bulk of them are headed in the right direction. Are there things that you see that you might, or reactions to some maybe participation investigations or requests for information that give you pause and actually help you identify those actors who you think are headed in the wrong direction?
Again,
no specific investigation, no discussion, no specific.
One thing that I think is an issue that we are looking at very closely, in part in response to President Biden's executive order on digital assets, is questions about international cooperation and jurisdictional arbitrage. And I think one of the things that is interesting to us is, putting aside, I think industry would take the position that they are trying to find places in which they can operate responsibly, be it in the United States or elsewhere. And the question for them then becomes, what regulatory regime are we going to subject ourselves to? And I would say from, again, a law enforcement perspective, for us, a lot of these cases, the ones that have the most pernicious and terrible activities are cross-border investigations. So the same challenges we see in international investigations apply in this context. Among those are, when you have, for instance, a entity that is incorporated sort of in one place, all their records are somewhere else, perhaps they hold their keys in a third place, we have to try to get to a point where people realize that if we see large-scale thefts that occur, for instance, by a nation state, go to their platform, we need to be in a place with industry recognizing that that's a unique harm that everyone can get around, realizing that's a problem, and perhaps in voluntary situations, be in a position where they would be willing to work with law enforcement. And it happens a lot, I will say, unfortunately, when there are situations in which, foreign platforms, DeFi in particular, may be victims of harm, where they're the ones who are suffering from bad actors who have stolen from them. One of the first entities they'll call is law enforcement. They'll call the FBI, they call the DOJ and ask for help, even if they're not located in the United States, because they realize that we have the capacity to help. And we're willing to help it because we think that a lot of these harms impact the American public writ large, and we're always willing to pick up the phone when a victim comes forward. So in that vein, we would ask that, given that we will help you when you're put in a hard spot, when you realize that billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars have left your platform and have gone somewhere, we'll work with you to try to find a solution and take in that case. On the converse, we'd also hope that if there are other situations in which other victims come forward and have problems, and we can follow the digital footprints and the blockchain to your platform, that you will consider cooperating with us, perhaps freezing those assets, sending them back to the victims, and making people whole.
Okay, and Carole, would you add anything in terms of how you identify those that are coming along versus those that seem to be running away or skirting some of the issues?
Well, I'd certainly point to the compliance guidance that OFAC has put out on sanctions compliance. Of course, everything that Eun-Young mentioned is completely spot on. Partnership with law enforcement, that's even listed by OFAC as a mitigating factor in considering enforcement action against sanctions violations. So is cybersecurity hygiene. I think those are really fascinating notes that the sector should take note of about something that really sends the message that government is prioritizing this and considering our own kind of enforcement. So otherwise, aside from just continuing to proactively engage, I think really looking at and acknowledging sometimes there's a lot of entities that like to claim that they're decentralized when in fact, if you look at their operations, they are pretty centralized. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity to take a look at guidance that places like FinCEN have put out about your responsibilities as an owner, operator, or administrator of some of these systems. And then aside from that, I would say that really looking at the other parts of the cryptocurrency ecosystem as well, like miners and validators, and where there's opportunities or potentially obligations. I know miners were pointed to as potentially having sanctions implications in the OFAC guidance, but I think those who are looking at what are their responsibilities, what are their authorities and capabilities to be able to work with law enforcement, to be able to self-police and combat illicit activity inside of the ecosystem. It's really those that are looking for ways that they can share information, with not just with U.S. government, but also with each other. The way that Eun-Young talked about it, it's not just cross-border, it's cross-platform. These require working together to identify these money laundering networks, to identify these cyber threats. So I think that we look to those out in the industry to figure out how you can work together, leverage what the government has given in the form of liability protections, like under the Cyber Info Sharing Act or 314B, to allow you guys to share information to better detect and prevent this illicit activity.
One thing real quick, just to follow up, and something Carole's always so good at is you sort of mentioning the cyber hygiene part, and Jamal, you mentioned that this was sort of part of this conversation. Look, I mean, when we talk about ransomware, and we talk about sort of these large-scale hacks by nation-state actors like Lazarus Group, obviously, it's a crypto issue to the extent that crypto is involved, right? But oftentimes crypto businesses are the victims of these kinds of attacks. In order to actually thwart them, we need to build out our cyber controls. We need to harden our cyber defenses. This is, to me, much more, in many respects, a cyber issue than it is sort of a crypto issue per se. But I think that it's sort of, part of sort of, I think the White House put out great guidance and an EO on this issue as well, because it's really sort of working with industry on also building out those cyber defenses, not just sort of the sort of crypto piece.
Yeah, I agree with that. That cyber hygiene is definitely an important part, especially when it comes to actual hacks of platforms. The one thing that I would just add to that is we're also seeing a rise just generally of where code is law and there are vulnerabilities within the code that allow for, under the code, that allow for the manipulation of voting, for instance, to divert funds from the people that are using the protocol to one particular actor. I don't want to get into the specifics of which ones. They are an interesting new development, which I do think is specific to DeFi in the sense that this doesn't usually happen in traditional financial models or financial firms. You are having, this type of manipulation of protocol can only occur because of the decentralized and voting and governance protocols that exist within those particular platforms. And so, I do think that along with sort of traditional cyber hygiene, I think industry should be taking, and I think they are now taking, a stronger look at the code itself to see if there are ways to manipulate or exploit certain vulnerabilities, separate and apart from hacking, but just dealing with the way in which the protocol is set up.
So this is one of the conversations that we had earlier, and I just want to pull the thread on this one a little bit too. The way that you explained it to me was to the extent that the protocols weren't in shape. You actually have situations where somebody is permitted to do something, and then what everybody might perceive as a hack is actually not a hack, and that hamstrings your ability to potentially respond to it. Is that right?
I think we're looking at it, and it really depends on what the facts of the situation are. But I think people traditionally in law enforcement think about our ability to investigate computer hacks under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is 18 U.S.C. 1030. The Supreme Court recently came out with a opinion, Van Buren, in which it makes very clear that and there's new guidance to this effect for department prosecutors, that we can only prosecute 1030 cases in instances in which the person is unauthorized in their sort of being in the network. Unauthorized access is really the standard. And a lot of these cases that we're seeing in the DeFi protocol area, especially as you've been reading about sort of abuses of governance protocols and voting rights within these systems, aren't unauthorized access per se. No one's hacking anything. What they're doing is being very sneaky with what the code allows. So if it's about stake, it's about putting up a certain amount of funds or money in order to allow for a certain amount of voting rights. Well, you can take out a flash loan, for instance, and all of a sudden in a very short period of time have incredible control over the voting system of that particular protocol and divert funds away from other individuals. And that is a different type of crime that we can look into, but does pose a problem in that, or a challenge in that, depending on the facts of the case, it may not be a computer hack. It may be some other type of fraud, but it's not as easy as just saying, well, it's clearly a computer hack under 1030.
Just to jump on that, I'll take kind of a different angle on this issue. It's really an area, cybersecurity and also compliance modernization. It should be an area that's a competitive advantage for the blockchain and crypto industry, especially when you compare the broader financial sector, which has dated technology infrastructures to some degree and global footprints that they've been running for decades in some cases. It's very difficult for them to modernize as quickly as you all can, who are building on brand new technology stacks, leveraging the most advanced kind of newest cloud infrastructures that you've all just created over the last couple of years. So the point being, it's much easier to apply these cybersecurity elements to your infrastructure at design level right now as you're building it. It's much harder, and I'm responsible for the treasury infrastructure as well. It's much harder managing legacy environments and then trying to apply these more advanced cybersecurity tools. So why not continue with that as your main competitive advantage, especially against the broader financial sector. It just seems logical that you would really want to play that up. But.
One of the things that we talked about in the very beginning is part of the impetus for the panel, was the focus on Russia. And I'll just throw this to you, Todd. I mean, does the U.S. government actually see Russian oligarchs and others evading sanctions through the use of digital assets? Is it something that didn't happen? And when we've said before, it's not all about Russia. To the extent that we don't see a lot in this space with Russian oligarchs, and you're going to tell me whether we do or we don't. Are there others that are actually out there acting as well?
Yeah, and the way we, and I've said this publicly on Ares' program at the start of the Russia sanctions program, we're approaching it as two different buckets of issues. Right? So you have the macro, can a G7 economy run on blockchain and crypto? And I mean, just look at U.S. private sector investments in blockchain and crypto over the last 5 years, hundreds of millions, if not more, invested. And certainly we're still in our early adoption, early stages, and not able to run broad payments that would be required of a G7 economy on blockchain at this point, right? Contrast that with Russia, which hasn't been making those same investments in blockchain. Do they have the technical aptitude? Certainly, but they haven't followed through with the same level of investment, right? So I would say they're even further behind. So no, they can't flip a switch and run their whole economy on crypto and blockchain overnight to respond to sanctions. So I kind of put that issue aside. But then on the micro issue, of course, it's a concern. It's a concern at the individual level. It's a concern at the oligarch level, and that's why we have to leverage all the investments we made in blockchain transparency tools to make sure that we stay on top of it and address it as we see it, which we have. And that's frankly how we expedited one of the reasons why we expedited the designation of the Hydra market. We started from day one of the sanctions program. We started to track broadly the macro flows in and out of the Russian crypto ecosystem, and basically. Depending on the week, around 6 to 8% we're touching at some point within one hop or two hops the Russian Hydra market, and that's where we lost a little bit of visibility on that. So that's why we moved very quickly with our DOJ partners and expedited all the work on the Hydra market to make sure we were closing on. Again, talking about a small percentage, right, even of the whole total Russia retail picture, but still certainly worth acting on, and we did very quickly with the support of our partners.
Yeah, I would just add to that. Look, I think I'm probably up here because I could say what they can't. From time to time. And look, Russian oligarchs are going to use absolutely anything to evade sanctions. They always have, and we have a playbook for it, whether it's from the original Crimea sanctions program or Russian election interference. There's a great report out of the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations from a couple years ago about sanctioned Russian oligarchs using high-value art to launder funds. They're going to use absolutely everything. But I think there's a couple really interesting dynamic things about the crypto space, and that is one, we've seen OFAC very effectively go after sort of non-compliant exchanges, the on-ramps and off-ramps for this types of sanctions evasion. We've seen them go after darknet markets. And then also the other piece is what we saw at TRM is the crypto industry really lean into this, particularly in the Russia-Ukraine context. We saw projects that had not necessarily thought about compliance start thinking about, at a minimum, how do we sort of screen, against sanctions, given that, there's certainly a responsibility here. So I think crypto enables sort of compliance in a way that you necessarily couldn't have before in the traditional finance space, and we've seen regulators and law enforcement have tools to sort of go after bad actors in the space as well.
Part of this is all about the dynamic between government and industry in terms of working together. And a lot of that is based on trust. And Young and I talked a little bit about what are some things that you might see to indicate that somebody might not want to be cooperative. Ari, I mean, this comes up in discussions with industry and government a lot. Do you feel that government is focusing correctly on those bad actors that are out there, or do you sometimes feel that to the extent that there are industry players that may be trying to cooperate, but are more easily within reach of government, sometimes get punished in this space. We're just trying to get a sense for what you feel that dynamic is like.
Look, when I was at Treasury, I think there was a real focus and sort of a start maybe on that sort of public-private partnerships, that sort of engagement. And I think we've only seen it get better, quite frankly. But that's what this is all about, right? I mean, that's why we're having this conversation today. And I think that there are a ton of opportunities to engage the private sector on these issues. And I think, my experience with obviously organizations like the Chamber and sort of just the crypto industry, at large is like that folks are very anxious to engage on these topics. I also, like, you can tell me, but anecdotally at least, and certainly when I was a prosecutor, frankly, crypto exchanges, for example, U.S.-based with compliant or U.S. With compliance programs, are very good at responding to subpoenas and search warrants and other sorts of legal process, even compared to sort of traditional finance. And I think that sort of that to me is always sort of shown, and that's sort of what I think agents and former agents have sort of talked about as well. And I think that it just needs to continue to get better. And it's still very early days. And I think what we're seeing now is building out compliance, building out cyber defenses in this really nascent industry as it grows. And I think it'll continue to sort of get better.
And Carole, a similar question to you, just along those lines. I mean, because I know that this is close to your heart, in terms of building the cooperation. What kind of messages do you think government can send to industry, or is there further information that they could provide to help build some of that trust?
Yeah, so I do believe that the government's going to continue to lean forward on providing information like typologies, red flags, and compliance guidance, like the kind of stuff that you've seen out of places like FinCEN and OFAC. I think the key message that we can say is that we're counting on you. You are on the front lines of all of this. It is your platforms that are being targeted. It's your platforms that are being exploited by these illicit actors. We rely so much on you. So I think just continuing to reinforce how critically important so much of your reporting and information is. I know from reading many SARs during my time at FinCEN, just how interesting and often filled with cyber indicators that SARs would be from fintech and crypto companies in a way that I wouldn't always get from traditional financial institutions, because you inherently have this tech readiness and literacy that other institutions may not. Of course, there would be other weaknesses that we would see sometimes in compliance with the crypto space, like thinking beyond one hop. And looking more broadly at the fact that, is that really a risk-based approach, your approach to anonymity-enhanced cryptocurrencies and mixing services and other things? So I think just highlighting that we really rely upon you. We're going to continue to lean in with our public-private partnerships, like you're seeing the growth of NCFTA working with crypto companies, like the NCI-JTF launched illicit virtual asset notification, IVAN partnership. The FinCEN Exchange program has hosted crypto companies on many occasions. So I think you're just going to continue to see more and more partnerships. We need your feedback, we need your input, including on things like the request for comment the Department of Commerce just posted for a competitiveness framework required under the executive order. So all those things, whether cemented as a specific partnership like IVAN or FinCEN Exchange, or just your own compliance and filing through SARs and your feedback to us about regulatory regime, competitiveness, and the technologies, in responsible technologies, because that's what we want to be competitive in. I think all of that is what we need from you.
All right, and we're down to about a minute left, and I asked each of our folks to think about if there was one important thing that you want to stress to this audience, whether it's been raised or not already. What do you want them to take away? I'll start with you, Onyon.
I get to go first. I think it's the theme that we've already touched upon, which is that we want the public sector to know, private industry to know, that they can always come to us, and that we want responsible actors in the ecosystem to know that we're here to not only help them with bad activity that they see in their platforms, but protect them from bad activity as well when they are victims. And so I think being responsible as actors within the ecosystem is to everyone's benefit, and we can work together to make sure that we can push illicit activity off.
Yeah, following up on that, it's just so critical that we start to push the message that we need proactivity now in the compliance space, not just waiting for government to respond and act. And that's what's going to get us to the next stage of adoption.
I feel like I'm Steph Curry. The shot clock in front of me is like going down. I'm like, I got to get this off. Look, I think that there are unique challenges when it comes to the cryptocurrency space, to be sure, but there are also sort of unique tools. And we see regulators and law enforcement using these tools in real time to regulate in ways that they never have before. And I think it's an extraordinary moment. And we should take advantage of the technology as we think about sort of what regulating or what new regulation in this space can look like.
And Carole, you kind of summarized before, so I'll take you off the hook, but I'm just going to add one more thing. You heard it from all of our speakers actually quite politely. Proactiveness. Yes, we're in an area where there may be confusion with respect to some of the regulations and who is doing what, but there are risks out there. They can be addressed, but everybody up here is telling you to be proactive with respect to those risks. And with that, we're at 0, and we'll call it a day. And I think somebody else comes here, but eventually we get to cocktails. So.